Hey, greetings. This is April 20th. Welcome to Lecture 2. As you can see, I've removed the dog from my picture. It did not want to. I was about ready to start just a few minutes ago, but it just wanted to stay on my lap and not move. So here we go. Lecture 2. We have been taking this journey of hermeneutics, right? Trying to understand the process by which an ancient text like the scripture can make sense in the current contemporary times that we live in. And hermeneutics we've defined as an art. Exegesis was the scientific methodology by which we mine meaning from the text, and you're working on your exegesis. And we've explored the text in terms of three worlds, right? So we've talked about the world behind the text, world of the text, world in front of the text. And that process has been trying to understand the role of how we understand the text and its meaning. And then we made a shift last week in which we talked about transmission of messaging, right? We talked about the author-speaker, we talked about the utterance or the written text, we talked about the intended audience, and then we ended up talking about the extended audience. And so I've included in this PowerPoint that dance partners thing. Like there's a set of dance partners in this process by which we come to understand meaning. Now, I want to spend some time talking to us a little bit here about the extended audience. Remember, extended audience are those who weren't necessarily intended for the text, but we come to the text as we're overhearing, interpreting, and learning how to apply the text to our lives. And one of the most significant ways that happens within the life of the church is the preached word. Preaching and teaching of the word is a means by which we take this ancient text and we learn how that we're overhearing, we learn how to interpret it and then apply it and introduce it into the lives of those that are listening. And we recognize that we've got all of the limitations that come with being the extended audience, and we've taken seriously the world in front of the text. But we have to, at some level, in some way, take this text then and help it to be meaningful to the congregations that we find ourselves in. And for many of us, that's going to take the form of either teaching in some form at a church, whether it's in a Sunday school class or amongst youth or teens, kids, or it's going to be preaching from a pulpit. And for me, there's an exchange that is happening there. There's a spiritual exchange between the preacher and the congregation through the Spirit by the text, and there's something unique that's taking place in that moment. And here's where the hard work that we've done in trying to understand the author-writer, trying to understand the utterance, written message, trying to understand who the intended audience was, the hard work of going through the exegetical process brings it to the point where then we say, okay, now I've got to say something about this text. And next week, that's what you're going to be doing. You're going to be saying something about this text to those of us who will be your audience. And it's going to be weird preaching to a camera instead of a group of people who can listen. And that's one of the challenges for me in this, because I would have loved for us to be sitting in a classroom where you'd have us out in front of you. Some of you are going to love this because you don't have to look at us. But I will tell you, there is something about when someone is sitting, and it's one of the most challenging things about preaching and teaching to a screen, because you don't get to see the responses and the reactions as you're preaching. Because one of the most beautiful things is when you can see the Spirit of God moving in someone's life as you're teaching them this text that you have spent a great deal of time working through so that it can be meaningful for the people that you've been called to speak in front of. But we're going to do this anyways, because you're going to have to trust that what you're going to be preaching to us will matter to us in the context of the assignment that I've asked you to do. So we're the extended audience. We're overhearing what was originally said, trusting that God intended it also for us, and then we're learning how to interpret and then apply it within our lives. And preaching becomes a vehicle for that transmission. Now, for some of you, you've never preached before, so I wanted to spend 2 lectures kind of just talking to you a little bit about some foundational elements about getting ready to preach, okay? So first off, I want you to go through your PowerPoint, and it says steps to writing a sermon. And I'm just going to give you a few little pieces, and then I'm going to explore it a little bit more in depth in the third lecture for this time. And step 1 is where we talked about Lectio Divina. It's that sacred reading of the text, slow reading of the text. Now, understanding that for many of you, steps 1 through 5 is going to come a little bit easier because we've been deeply engaged in the work of exegesis already. But it's really just stewing in that passage. When I would write sermons, I would typically read my passage a week before I would start writing anything because I wanted to be stewing in that passage. Now, honestly, I typically built my preaching series out 6 months out, and so I was constantly stewing in those texts anyways. But you stew in this text, you live in this text, you want this text to speak to you, to challenge you. And then as I'm thinking about writing a sermon, I do what's called the five senses. And I was taught this method by Dr. Dan Boone, who is the president of Trevecca. The five senses is asking the questions as we're sort of wading through and stewing around in the text. What am I seeing? What am I hearing? What am I smelling? What am I tasting? What am I touching? What is happening in this text that is shaping my understanding of the world of that text? Like what is unique about the text that is grabbing hold of me and bringing me in, drawing me in? What picture is being painted in this text? You know, when we think about like someone like Nehemiah who jumps on horseback and rides through the ruins, I want to be in the ruins with him. I want to imagine what that must have felt like and looked like and been like in that situation. And so that's the five senses. We want to engage the imagination. Then step 3 is questions about the text, right? What is God doing? That's a good question to be asking in that. What are humans doing in this text? What's the good news? What's the bad news? What makes you curious? Start asking the questions of the text, because those are probably the questions that other people have of the text. And honestly, it's going to shape your exegesis when you finally get into that part. Then we create what's called a word chart or an image chart. And this is where, as things begin to stand out, I begin to write little words and draw circles and make connections because I want sort of an image, something to emerge from the text that I can really get my heart and mind around. Then I'm going to go to the work of exegesis, which you've been doing. So much of this work you've been sort of doing over the last few weeks. And again, I really want you to spend some time in those first 3 or 4 steps as you reflect upon your exegesis, because that's where it's going to come alive with the congregation. The next step is pick your house. Now, in the next lecture, I'm going to talk to you about what it means to pick our house. This is your landing point. Like, where do you want this sermon to land? How will you know when you're done with the sermon what you wanted those outcomes to be? I'll explore that a little bit more in the next lecture. Then you're gonna exegete the congregation. Who am I speaking to, and why would it matter? So in this terms, you're going to be speaking to us. You're going to be speaking to your classmates. But I like to imagine when I preach and I'm writing a sermon, who's going to be sitting in front of me? What kind of people? And so generally, a lot of times when I would write sermons, I might write 15, 20 names of people in my congregation, and never the same 15, 20 names, and try to imagine how might they hear what I'm about to say. What is going on in their lives, and how might they interpret or be influenced by how I'm preaching and how I'm teaching in these moments. Then you're going to pick your vehicle, and we're going to talk about that in the next lecture. What does it mean to pick your vehicle? These are the forms that preaching can take that will help you give some form to what you're about to say. And then you find your hook, and we're going to talk about that in the next lecture as well, which is how do you get people hooked? How do you get people drawn in on the front end? Like, what does it mean to step into it and immediately engage your audience? And then the 10 is write the sermon. Actually sit down and write it out. Now, you are going to write your sermon as a manuscript, and you're going to submit that manuscript to me. I know some of you might like to preach from outlines. I want a manuscript, and so you're going to get that manuscript to me in the process. Okay, so you're going to write the sermon. So those are just some steps. Now I'm going to break that down a little bit further into the next one. But what I want you to keep in mind from this lecture is that you've been doing the work of exegesis, which is the study of a text. Now we're going to translate that exegesis into the work of preaching. And we're going to be reminded that we are the extended audience that overhears this passage, then learns how to interpret this passage, then applies this passage. And then in the medium of transmission is often the preached message. And that preached message, there are certain steps that we take with the text to make it come alive. And that's what I want to encourage us to talk about in this next lecture.